Eric Lascelles of RBC Global Asset Management joining us. What do you make of the trend of people getting back to work, especially those who were on temporary layoff, and whether or not that's going to hold true as we get through this uncertain fall period, Eric?
Right. Yeah, I think there's several important thoughts there. And so one would be, unsurprisingly, the people who were officially temporarily unemployed, or the people who indeed were temporarily unemployed. They've gotten their jobs back for the most part, with some exceptions, but that's where a lot of the hiring has come from. And so that's a logical thing. Obviously, that does then imply something else, which is that the remainder of people who are unemployed are not temporarily unemployed. These are often people who need to go find a new employer and need to hope that there are employers out there who are hiring. And so the second half of this recovery is going to be a whole lot slower. And we've known that for a while. We got through the first half of the rehiring in about 3 months in Canada, which is pretty extraordinary. Let's look for it to be a couple of years probably to get through the other half. And so we saw that in the headline number today in terms of 245,000 jobs. The prior month was 419. Of course, even bigger gains before that. And so it slows down from here, in part just because we're losing these natural matchings between employers and employees, but just more fundamentally because we're not opening as many sectors anymore. Most of the sectors that were able to be opened during a pandemic have now been opened. From here, it's going to have to be businesses doing things more cleverly and incremental productivity gains and these kinds of things, and battling against some gradual erosion of fiscal support and battling against some standard lags in terms of mortgage problems that can accrue later and credit problems that accrue later. And so, again, it will be slower and slower from here, but I'm still delighted we're making this kind of progress. I think we almost hit that milestone of a sub 10% unemployment rate. The U.S. got through it. Canada just missed, but nevertheless made some big progress. And you mentioned self-employment as well. And the self-employment, certainly self-employment is crucial, and it's where a lot of entrepreneurship comes from, but it's also where a lot of people go when their normal salary job isn't quite holding together. And so the idea that self-employment has now come down for the first time, to me, is almost a good thing, in the sense that it suggests a lot of these people are probably getting back into more traditional, more full-time type jobs.
I want to just keep going through some of the numbers. Eric Lascelles joining us from RBC Global Asset Management. Folks, if you're just joining us right now, we're walking through the details of the August jobs report in this country. Overall, 245,000 plus jobs created, a deceleration from what we had been seeing in recent months, but a lot of new full-time jobs. Looking across the country, in Ontario in particular, 142,000 new jobs created in August, nearly all in full-time work. Looking at areas like Toronto, employment up steadily in that market. In Quebec, employment increasing by 54,000 positions during the month. We also saw, when it comes to sector breakdown, services sector employment outpacing the goods producing sector. I also want to talk about concerns that we've highlighted several times already this morning, for example. Stats Canada highlighting gender gaps in labor force participation persist. We talked about how overall the pandemic has impacted the jobs of women more than men. And Stats Canada also highlighting that unemployment remains high for Arab, Black, and Southeast Asian Canadians based on the August data. They say the employment rate increases for very recent immigrants did rise. That was driven by declining immigration, which obviously has been a key driver of the Canadian economy in recent years. And I guess there are some questions about what happens on the immigration front until we get to the end of COVID-19. Meanwhile, some employment declines for Indigenous people. Stats Can saying employment among Indigenous people living off reserve down 1.8% from July to August. Eric Lascelles still with us. I thought that would be an important additional bit of context on how all Canadians are being impacted by this pandemic. Eric, any thoughts on those data points?
No, you're absolutely right. And so we've heard that term she-cession coined, and indeed women did suffer the brunt of the job losses, certainly not all, but a disproportionate share. And that does link into increased female employment in some sectors that were just on the front lines and hit so obviously. And so it's nice to see that some of these sectors are starting to come back and perhaps beginning to rebalance. But of course, there is another fundamental issue, which is childcare. And so here we are in a world in which daycare spaces are substantially reduced from before because of declining ratios and so on. Not everyone is able to go back to school as students, and so that burden often does fall disproportionately on women, and so that challenge probably stays to some extent. And some of the other comments certainly valid as well in terms of some more vulnerable groups or groups that have traditionally had a more precarious hold on employment, such as recent immigrants having suffered to a greater extent. And so it just speaks to the importance of getting all of these jobs back as well. And I suppose only in the interest of some amount of gender parity, one thing I've often thought was quite interesting is you've had women affected more adversely by the recession element of this. Of course, men affected more adversely by the pandemic element. Men have been dying to a greater extent, and so I suppose there is some sort of offset there.
All right. Now, I do have to also highlight what's happening south of the border, Eric, because, look, at the end of the day, the global market focuses more attention on the U.S. job story, which also broke at 8:30 Eastern time. There's a look at what's happening with the futures, which the tone has improved a little bit since the jobs report came out. The expectation was that we were going to see more than 1.3 million jobs created. The number coming in pretty close to that at 1.37 million, so slightly more than forecast. You're still seeing a similar trend in the United States of a deceleration of the number of new jobs being added. But I thought it was kind of interesting, Eric, the unemployment rate declining to 8.4%. The expectations on Wall Street were that it would be 9.8%. And as I look at the range of estimates on Wall Street, an 8.4% unemployment rate is lower than even the lowest estimate, and it's quite an improvement from a 14.7% unemployment rate, which we saw at the peak south of the border in April. Can you just give us your sense on how the U.S. economy has been performing by comparison?
Right. Well, I mean, certainly a nice looking job creation number with that 1.4 million. Though, of course, Canadians should remember Canada is 1/10 the population. And so actually Canada was generating more new jobs on a per capita basis. And so we should feel good about that. But a significant and, as you said, above consensus job creation number there. That unemployment rate is the thing that's catching my eye as well. And I'm trying to dig into the details, but not entirely successfully at this point. But 8.4%, as you say, notably lower than expected. The debate was, would the U.S. unemployment rate come through that 10% threshold? Indeed, it did with flying colors. And so I guess that answer is there. But it's a little bit surprising that it's come down that much. And I've started taking a peek. And for instance, labor force participation rate numbers have wiggled a bit as well. And sometimes you see these big drops in unemployment rates because people stop looking for jobs, as an example. It would be hard to square that big a drop with the number of jobs created. And so that remains a little bit mysterious. To my eye, that would then suggest some vulnerability perhaps to that number not improving as much over the next few months, just because it seems to be a little bit ahead of itself. We still know there are 10 million plus Americans more than normal unemployed right now. And so it's still a long way from those good old days of sub 4% U.S. unemployment rates, but it's nevertheless some pretty significant progress. And as I mentioned, for Canada, also some pretty decent looking wage numbers here. Some just compositional, some low wage workers just out of the labor force, making it look like the rest of us are getting big wage hikes, but nevertheless decent looking on that front. Maybe the two things that undermine this slightly to my eye, there were some negative revisions for prior months, still pretty small. Maybe more fundamentally, the U.S. is going through a census year right now. And as far as I can tell, about 240,000 jobs, new jobs, were attributed to that. And so those are temporary. It's not because the economy is looking better. It's just because you've got this somewhat haphazard thing happening at the same time. So maybe not quite as good after all that. But boy, single-digit unemployment rates look pretty good in 2020.